Beneath the gray skies of a forgotten city park, a war-weary veteran sat on a weathered bench, unwrapping half a sandwich he could barely afford. When he noticed a homeless man shivering nearby, he didn't hesitate. He split his meal, handed over his coffee, and offered something even rarer: dignity. What Ben Callahan didn't know was that this simple act of kindness was being watched. Just days later, a black car rolled up to the shelter where Ben lived, carrying a man whose fortune could fill palaces, but whose heart had never forgotten the streets. That one shared meal would ignite a chain of events neither man could have imagined. From the depths of struggle to the halls of a mansion, from broken trust to newfound purpose, their lives would entwine in a mission that would change not just themselves, but countless others. This isn't just a story about generosity. It's about how one quiet moment can ripple through the world, awakening hope in places long abandoned. Stay with us, because by the end, you'll believe what Ben Callahan came to understand. Sometimes the richest people wear worn boots, and the greatest fortunes begin with half a sandwich. The wind pushed through the bare branches like it had somewhere urgent to be, rattling the old trees that lined the edge of Fifth Street Park. It was the kind of cold that crept through layers, biting at skin and bone without apology. The sky hung heavy, a dull shade of gray that blurred the line between late morning and dusk. On a worn bench near the edge of a frozen fountain, Ben Callahan sat hunched over a brown paper bag, his gloved hands fumbling with the wax paper inside. The sandwich wasn't much. Day-old turkey on white bread, no mayo, no frills, just fuel. But to Ben, it was enough. It had to be. He ate like a man trained not to waste, taking slow, measured bites as he watched the world pass by. People with places to be, cars hissing over slush, a mother hurrying a child along the sidewalk, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big. Ben didn't mind being invisible. Most days he preferred it. Across the path, near the stone wall that separated the park from the city's bus terminal, sat a man whose face was lost beneath layers of scarves and weather-beaten grime. His coat was more duct tape than fabric, and his hands trembled as he rubbed them together for warmth. Ben noticed the way the man's eyes kept flicking toward his sandwich, not pleading, not begging, just watching. Quiet hunger. Without thinking, Ben stood. He crossed the short distance, sat beside the man, and wordlessly tore his sandwich in half. No grand gesture, no speech, just an offering. He handed it over along with his half-finished cup of coffee, still warm in the thermos he carried everywhere. "Here," he said simply. The man hesitated, eyes wide, then reached out with shaking hands. "Thank you," he whispered. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a while. "Most people, they just walk on by." Ben nodded. "I've been there." They ate in silence, the kind of silence that says more than words. There was no need to trade life stories or ask questions neither wanted to answer. For a few minutes they just were, 2 men, 2 halves of a sandwich, and the shared weight of things they didn't speak aloud. "Name's Joe," the man finally said, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Ben. Army." "Yeah." Joe smiled, toothless but sincere. "Figured. You've got that look." Ben didn't ask what he meant. He knew. A gust of wind blew snow in lazy circles around their feet. Ben stood, reaching into his duffel. He pulled out his old army jacket, threadbare, patched in 3 places, but still warm, and held it out. "You'll need this more than I will." Joe's hands hovered over the jacket like it was made of gold. "You sure?" Ben nodded. "I've got layers. You've got duct tape." Joe laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise even him. As Ben turned to go, he felt lighter, though nothing in his life had changed. Same cot waiting for him at the shelter, same stack of job applications with no callbacks, same quiet ache in his leg from a wound that hadn't quite healed, and probably never would. But that moment, sharing something when he had so little, it stayed with him. Neither of them noticed the black car idling across the street, its tinted windows just cracked enough for someone inside to watch. The man inside, in a suit worth more than anything Ben owned, didn't say a word. He just watched, and when Ben disappeared down the sidewalk, he made a note. Some kindnesses echo. Some acts, small as they seem, change the course of more than one life. Ben Callahan had no idea, but he was about to. The cold followed Ben down the street like a shadow, lingering in his collar and nipping at his heels. The city never quite slept, but this part of it, where the streets cracked and steam curled from grates, had a rhythm all its own. Familiar, forgotten. He walked with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who'd learned long ago not to waste energy. His duffel bounced lightly against his hip with each step, carrying everything he owned worth holding on to. It was nearly dark by the time he reached the shelter. St. Mark's had more than 4 walls and a roof. It was a haven built from paper-thin funding and thick-skinned volunteers. Ben nodded to the night staffer, a young guy named Luis, barely 20, all energy and hope. "Hey, Sergeant," Luis said with a grin, the nickname sticking ever since Ben fixed the busted furnace during a cold snap. "You're late for dinner." Ben gave a tired half-smile. "Gave it away." Luis didn't ask. He knew better. Just slid a styrofoam container across the counter. "Still warm. Beef stew, kind of." Ben took it with a nod. Kind of was better than most meals he remembered from deployment. The common room was dim, lit mostly by a flickering TV showing muted sports highlights. A few other men and women were scattered around, some reading, some dozing, some staring into the kind of distance you can't measure. Ben sat alone, unwrapping his meal on a plastic tray, steam curling up into the air like breath. He ate in silence, his mind drifting, not to the sandwich or the jacket or even Joe's cracked smile, but to a memory buried so deep he didn't let it surface often. A campfire in a desert, laughter between brothers in arms, the feeling of being needed, of having a place in the world. Those days were gone, but sometimes a smell or a gesture or the weight of cold on your shoulders could bring it all back. When the meal was done, Ben helped Luis mop the floor without being asked. Habit, really. He didn't like sitting idle, and he didn't like owing favors. After, he climbed the creaking stairs to his bunk. Top 1, 3rd row, back wall. Same spot he'd claimed when he arrived nearly 2 years ago. He sat on the edge for a long while, hands folded, head bowed. He wasn't a man of prayer, not anymore, but he had his moments of quiet conversation with the universe. Tonight, he didn't say anything, just listened. Somewhere outside, tires crunched over snow. Downstairs, Luis heard it first, a sleek black car pulling up beside the shelter, headlights cutting through the frost-covered windows. It didn't fit. Not here. A man stepped out, dark suit, leather gloves, purpose in every movement. He walked up the steps slowly like he didn't want to startle anyone. His knock was firm but polite. Luis answered, confused but composed. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, a practiced but not unkind expression. "I'm looking for Ben Callahan." Luis raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because yesterday he gave away half a sandwich, and I think it's time someone returned the favor." Upstairs, Ben stirred. He didn't know it yet, but this knock was different. It wasn't about charity or inspections or someone needing help fixing the water heater. It was an opportunity, dressed in a tailored coat, waiting in the snow, and it had his name on it. The next morning dawned slowly and silver, the kind of gray light that seeped through frosted windows and made everything feel quieter than it was. Ben was already up, seated on a milk crate behind the shelter, sipping coffee from a dented metal thermos that had survived more miles than most cars. The sky threatened snow again, and his breath came in visible puffs. He didn't mind the cold. It made him feel awake, real. He wasn't expecting company. The shuffle of shoes on the pavement made him glance up. Joe was back, wrapped in Ben's old army jacket, which looked even more worn in the daylight. His beard was still unkempt, his eyes sunken, but there was something different in the way he stood. A little straighter, a little less afraid. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Ben said. Joe shrugged. "Didn't think I'd be warm again, to be honest." Ben nodded toward the stoop. "Sit, still got half a thermos." Joe obeyed without a word, settling beside him like they'd done this 100 times before. They sipped in silence for a while. Birds chirped somewhere high above, confused by the cold snap. "Name's Joe," he said eventually. "Ben, you military?" Ben gave him a side glance. "Yeah, you?" Joe shook his head. "Electrician, used to run my own shop. One bad month turned into a bad year. Wife left. House foreclosed. Then it got quiet." He stared down at the steam rising from his cup. "You wake up one day and realize no one knows your name anymore." Ben nodded slowly. He didn't say "I understand" because that phrase was too small, too overused. But he did understand, deep in his bones. Joe looked at him. "You gave me your coat. That's the first time someone's done something like that in a long while." Ben sipped again, eyes on the horizon. "We all need help sometimes. Doesn't mean we're less." Joe chuckled. "You sound like my old man. Preacher, kind of." "Well, I'm not. Could have fooled me." Ben didn't reply, just leaned back against the wall and let the quiet speak for them. Joe left a little while later with the rest of the coffee and a thank you that didn't need to be spoken aloud. But as he turned the corner, Ben noticed something else. A black car parked across the street. Same one from the day before. Engine idling, watching, again. That evening the wind changed. Not the kind you can feel against your skin, but the kind that settles in your gut. Quiet and certain. Ben felt it as he climbed into his bunk, the murmurs in the hallway just a little too soft, the shelter staff just a little too distracted. Luis found him near the stairs. "Hey, Ben, you've got a visitor." Ben drowned. "At this hour?" Louis nodded, motioning toward the main entrance. "He says he's not from the government, if that helps." Ben descended the stairs slowly, cautious. His boots thudded against each creaky step until he reached the door. There he was again, the man in the tailored coat. Same calm expression, same quiet purpose. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "sorry to bother you at this hour." Ben studied him. "You're not from the city, not with that coat." The man smiled faintly. My name is Charles Whitmore." Ben's brow furrowed. He'd heard that name, somewhere between the evening news and half-forgotten city projects. "I saw what you did in the park," Charles said, voice steady. "I saw the way you looked at that man, not like a case, not like a problem, like a person." Ben shifted his weight. "Why were you watching?" "Because I was once where he is, and someone saw me too." Charles extended a crisp envelope. Inside, an address, an invitation. "My driver will be here tomorrow at 10. If you're willing, I'd like to buy you lunch at my home." Ben looked down at the envelope, then back at the man. "I don't take handouts." "It's not a handout," Charles said. "It's a conversation, and maybe the beginning of something bigger." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the snow, leaving Ben holding the first opportunity he'd seen in years. And the wind, unseen, silent, whispered that something was coming, something that wouldn't just change his day, it would change everything. The envelope sat on Ben's lap long after the man had gone, its edges soft from how many times he'd flipped it over, considered tearing it, considered walking it straight to the trash. It wasn't distrust that held him back. It was something more complicated. Hope, maybe. Or the fear of it. The shelter quieted as night pressed in. Snores rumbled from the bunks, and the television buzzed low with the static comfort of late-night infomercials. But Ben lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way Charles Whitmore had said one thing in particular. Maybe the beginning of something bigger. He'd been down that road before, promises that led to letdowns, people who meant well until it got hard. Still, when morning light began to sneak through the shelter's high windows, Ben was already up, shaving with cold water, pressing his best shirt, the one with the least wear, and brushing his boots until they looked just barely respectable. Luis watched him from the hallway. "Are you going somewhere fancy, Sergeant?" Ben shrugged. "Someone invited me to lunch." Luis arched an eyebrow, lips twitching with a grin. "You clean up good. Just don't forget us little people." Ben gave a rare smile. "Doubt there's any forgetting that." At precisely 10 o'clock, the black car returned. The vehicle gleamed like it didn't belong in this part of town. Its tires crushed the grit and broken glass of the old pavement with the quiet authority of wealth. As it rolled to a stop in front of the shelter, every conversation in the lobby stilled. Eyes tracked the doors as they opened, and a driver in a dark overcoat stepped out. He didn't say a word, just opened the rear door. Ben hesitated for a full beat before stepping forward, the envelope clutched in one calloused hand. He paused by the door and turned back briefly, shelter walls peeling, Luis giving him a salute with a mop. One man reading yesterday's paper like it was fresh news. Then Ben ducked into the car, and the door shut with a soft thump that sounded like crossing a line. Inside, the warmth was immediate. Leather seats, soft music playing low, some jazz tune that felt out of place and yet perfect. Charles Whitmore sat across from him, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "I'm glad you came," he said. Ben didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the city sliding past the tinted windows. "You live far from this side of town." Charles nodded. "By design at one point. Now, maybe that's changing." They drove in silence a while longer until the buildings grew taller, cleaner, and newer. Iron gates opened to reveal a long, winding driveway, flanked by evergreens and stone lions. At the top stood a mansion carved out of white stone and glass. its windows tall enough to reflect the sky. Ben stepped out slowly. "This is your place," Charles smiled faintly, "for better or worse." Inside, the home was warm, modern, but not cold. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. Paintings lined the walls, some abstract, some clearly from another era. Ben felt like his boots were too loud on the hardwood. Lunch was set in a sunlit room that overlooked the lawn. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and a pitcher of iced tea already sweating on the table. "I asked my chef to keep it simple," Charles said. Ben chuckled. "Looks a lot like fancy to me." They sat. "I didn't bring you here to impress you," Charles said, pouring the tea. "I brought you here because I saw something rare." Ben took a sip. "A guy sharing a sandwich with a stranger?" "No," Charles said quietly. "A man giving what little he had without asking for anything in return. You didn't do it to be seen, that's why I noticed." Ben leaned back. "You're not just here to say thank you." "No," Charles admitted. "I want to show you something. After lunch." And though Ben didn't yet understand what this man wanted from him, or why, he found himself saying the words he hadn't said in a long time. "All right." They finished lunch with barely a dent in the food. Ben had eaten slow, cautious, like someone unused to silver cutlery and cloth napkins, but not so timid that he wouldn't finish a good meal. Charles watched without judgment, offering refills of tea and stories about the house, the art, his early days in business. None of it was boastful, just details lightly shared like breadcrumbs on a trail. But Ben didn't follow the path. Instead, when Charles paused, Ben looked him square in the eye and said, "Why me?" Charles set his glass down. "Because I've been where you are. Maybe not in boots or in battle, but I know what it's like to feel discarded by the world. And I know what it takes to come back from that." Ben crossed his arms. "And what exactly are you offering? A job? A donation?" Charles shook his head. "I'm offering a partnership." That word hit the air heavy. Ben raised an eyebrow. "I don't have much to offer. I'm a veteran with a bad leg and a bunk in a shelter." Charles leaned forward. "You have something I lost a long time ago, integrity that hasn't been polished for appearances. You didn't ask for anything from Joe. You didn't need thanks. That's the kind of foundation I want to build something on." Ben looked away toward the vast window. Outside, the snow had started again, thin, hesitant flakes that dusted the glass like ash. "You're not the first person to come at me with big words," Ben said finally. "Most of them just wanted a story for a speech or a photo for a fundraiser." "This isn't about a photo," Charles said. "This is about building something that matters. I've spent decades making money. Now I want to make a difference, and I need someone who can keep me honest while I do it." Ben's eyes flicked back to him, narrowed. "Let me show you something," Charles said, standing. They moved into a side hallway where the mood shifted. Photos on the walls changed from boardrooms and charity galas to faded shots of alleyways, soup kitchens, sleeping bags on concrete. "Do you know any of these guys?" Charles asked. Ben squinted. "That's 6th and Maple, near the bus terminal." Charles nodded. "Used to sleep there 10 years ago, before a small loan and a second chance got me back on my feet." Ben looked at him, surprised. "I was invisible too," Charles said quietly, "until someone saw me." Ben followed Charles through a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, lined with thick rugs and soft light. But what waited at the end was nothing he expected. The room was smaller, simpler, walls of reclaimed wood, a desk scarred with use, a single American flag folded neatly in a display case beside a photograph of a younger Charles in a cheap suit, standing in front of a payphone. "This is where I make the real decisions," Charles said, gesturing inside. "Not in the boardroom, here." Ben walked in slowly. The room smelled of old wood and fresh coffee. There was no pretense in it, just purpose. On the desk lay a stack of folders, each labeled with the same initials, HOME, helping others make entries. "A program I've been working on," Charles explained. "Shelters, job training, mental health support, but not the kind built for headlines. Quiet help, permanent help." Ben ran a hand across the edge of the desk. "And you want me involved?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened one of the folders. Inside were pictures of shelters like St. Mark's, letters from veterans, case files, handwritten notes from social workers, and at the bottom, Ben's name, his file, his service history, discharge papers. "You did your homework," Ben said, voice low. "I had to be sure," Charles replied. "This isn't charity, it's a partnership. I want someone who understands what the men in those shelters really need. Who's living it?" Ben sank into the chair across from him. "You want me to run this?" "Number, I want you to help build it, from the ground up." Ben looked around the room. "Why me?" "Because you didn't wait for someone to ask. You saw someone hurting and acted. No cameras, no fanfare. That's leadership." The words felt heavy, not because they were flattery, but because Ben hadn't seen himself that way in years. Charles leaned forward. "What do you say, Ben? Will you help me do something real?" Ben glanced back at the hallway, at the photographs of pain, of perseverance, then down at the file still open in front of him. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. The return drive from the mansion felt different than the ride in. Ben didn't speak much, and Charles didn't push. The city outside the window looked sharper now, clearer somehow. Same broken sidewalks, same boarded-up shops. But Ben saw more than the decay. He saw people, faces, stories like his own. When the car pulled up to the shelter again, the sun had dipped just enough to light the sky in hues of gold and blue. Ben stepped out slowly, envelope in hand, and turned back to the man who had, without warning, offered him something more than a meal. "I'll think about it," he said. Charles smiled. "That's all I ask." Ben watched the car disappear down the block, exhaust curling into the cold air. He didn't go inside right away. Instead, he sat on the same bench outside, coat collar turned up, hands clasped together. He wasn't used to hope. It itched under the skin. Restless, hungry. Luis poked his head out the door a few minutes later. "Everything okay, Sergeant?" Ben nodded. "Just digesting." "What, the food or the future?" Ben gave a small, tired laugh. "Bit of both." He rose, joints groaning in protest, and headed inside. That night, he ate dinner at the shelter like always. Same plastic tray, same chipped plate. But something had shifted. The food didn't taste different, but he did. Somewhere in the back of his mind, something new had started to take root. Possibility. 3 days passed before Ben saw Charles again. This time, it was Ben who made the call. They met in a quiet office tucked behind a community center downtown. No suits, no cameras, just Charles, a laptop, and 2 mugs of black coffee. "I want to show you something," Charles said, powering on the laptop. The screen lit up with grainy footage, security cam angle time stamp blinking in the corner. It was the park bench. Ben and Joe, the sandwich, the jacket. Every detail captured in silent, unfiltered clarity. Ben stared at it, jaw tight. "You recorded us?" "Not me, the city. I had someone pull it when I was looking into you." Ben's expression didn't soften. "Why are you showing me this?" Charles didn't speak right away. He clicked another video. This one was recent. Joe again, this time cleaner, wearing Ben's jacket, standing in line at a community soup kitchen. He looked stronger. He was talking to someone, laughing. "That's what happens when people feel seen," Charles said. "One act ripples." Ben sat back, arms crossed. He didn't like being the center of attention, never had. But as the videos played, people helping others, quiet acts of kindness, small sparks of dignity, he realized something. He wasn't being watched. He was being witnessed. Charles turned off the laptop. "Still think it was just a sandwich?" Ben didn't answer, but his silence said more than words ever could. Ben sat on the edge of his bunk that night, the glow of the hallway light slanting through the crack in the door. The footage Charles had shown him played again and again in his head. Not just the image of Joe, cleaner, healthier, but the quiet way he laughed, like something in him had been gently nudged back to life. Could a single act really spark that kind of change? He thought about the jacket he'd given Joe. He hadn't missed it. In fact, in the days since, he'd forgotten it was even gone. But seeing it wrapped around Joe's shoulders, worn like armor, it made Ben feel something strange, like a part of him was still out there walking the city, standing in line for soup, maybe even finding a new place to sleep. And if that part of him could survive, maybe the rest could too. The next morning, Ben returned to the park bench. He didn't know what he expected. Joe wasn't there. The snow had melted into slush and gravel. The fountain was still dry, still cracked. But the bench was there, waiting, so he sat. For a while, the world moved around him. Joggers passed. A street musician set up nearby. A woman fed pigeons with crumbs from a paper bag. And then, like the city itself had answered his unspoken call, Joe appeared. He looked better, still rough around the edges, but cleaner, his beard trimmed, jacket zipped to the collar. He spotted Ben and smiled, walking over with a styrofoam cup in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said. Ben shrugged. "I had a feeling you'd be back." Joe handed him the cup. "Coffee. Still terrible, but it's hot." Ben took it. "Thanks." They sat in silence, sipping, the kind of silence that felt earned. Joe finally spoke. "You know what I did with the rest of that sandwich?" Ben glanced at him. "Threw it at pigeons?" Joe chuckled. "Gave half of it to this kid sleeping under the bridge on the 9th. Looked like he hadn't eaten in 2 days, took one bite and cried." Ben didn't say anything, but a slow warmth unfurled in his chest. "Didn't think I had it in me," Joe continued, "to help somebody else. Not when I've been the one needing help so long." "You did," Ben said. "That's what matters." Joe looked at him. "So, what's next for you?" Ben exhaled slowly. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Joe reached into his coat and pulled out a wrinkled flyer. "Saw this at the community board. Some guy named Whitmore started a program for vets, people with nowhere to go. Sounded familiar." Ben took the flyer. It was the first print of the HOME initiative. His name wasn't on it, but he saw his fingerprints all over it. "Looks like second chances are going around," Joe said. Ben folded the flyer, slipping it into his coat pocket. Yeah, looks that way. A week later, Ben returned to the mansion. This time he walked in without hesitation. The butler, a kind-eyed man named Elliot, greeted him with a nod and offered to take his coat. Ben declined. He liked the weight of it around his shoulders. It reminded him he was still grounded. Charles was waiting in the study, seated by the fireplace with a glass of tea instead of the usual whiskey. He looked more relaxed today, dressed in a cardigan and loafers, as if the sharp edges of his businessman shell had softened. "I'm glad you came," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Ben took the seat, scanning the room. It hadn't changed, but he noticed new details now. The bookshelf sagging slightly under the weight of well-read volumes, the photograph of Charles and a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes on the mantel. "Your wife?" Ben asked. Charles nodded, smile tightening. "She passed away 5 years ago, cancer." Ben bowed his head slightly. "Sorry." "She was the first person who believed in me," Charles said, "when I was still sleeping on bus-stop benches, when I had no name anyone cared about. She saw past all that." Ben nodded. "Hard to find people like that." Charles turned toward the fire. "I didn't always live in mansions. I used to beg for change on 43rd Street. Then I met a man named Roy, old Navy vet, used to sweep the sidewalk outside a diner. One day he told me to come inside, bought me eggs and toast, said, 'The world might forget you, but I won't.'" Ben listened, unmoving. "He gave me a job sweeping the sidewalk, too, paid me under the table, gave me a place to sleep on his couch, and when I saved enough to start something, he gave me half of what he had in the bank." "Why?" Ben asked. "Because someone had once done the same for him." Charles stood, pacing slowly. "The money I have now? It doesn't mean much. But the trust, the faith that someone can climb out of the darkest hole and pull another up behind them, that's priceless." He looked back at Ben. "You remind me of Roy, of myself, of everyone who ever stood at the edge of nothing and still reached for someone else." Ben leaned forward. "Then let's build something they can hold on to." And in that moment, without handshakes or contracts, the real work began. 2 days later, Ben found himself once again at the long table in Charles's modest decision room, the one lined with reclaimed wood and truth instead of marble and ego. This time there was a folder waiting for him, not full of reports or proposals, but something far simpler. "Take a look," Charles said, sitting across from him, calm and clear-eyed. Ben opened the folder. Inside was a map, highlighted parcels of land across the city and beyond. Abandoned buildings, empty lots, former factories now sitting in ruin. Beneath each parcel was a scribbled note: potential rehab housing, job training center, veteran clinic. Ben looked up slowly. Charles clasped his hands. "These are the places I want to invest in, with you, with your eyes and your judgment. You know what our people need. I have the resources. You have the experience. I'm not offering a seat in a boardroom, Ben. I'm offering you something better, the right to shape something real." Ben sat back. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," Charles replied. "I want you as a co-founder. Title, salary, and most importantly, voice. Say yes, and we start laying the foundation next week." Ben stared at the map again. Every pin felt like a person waiting for a second chance. "Let me sleep on it." Charles nodded. "You've earned that." Ben didn't sleep much that night. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, weighing the weight of the decision against the weight of his past. He thought about the other men in the shelter, the quiet ones, the broken ones, the ones who still flinched at loud sounds or stared too long at their own hands. He thought about what it meant to build something, about how easily things fell apart. The next morning he showed up at Charles's mansion again, coat dusted with snow, eyes heavy. "I can't take the offer," he said, standing just inside the foyer. "Not like that, not with that kind of title." Charles blinked, surprised. "Why not?" Ben stepped forward. "Because I'm not a symbol, Charles. I'm not someone you can polish up and point to and say, 'Look what I saved.' I'll help build. I'll give my insight. I'll even wear a clean shirt if it helps, but I won't be your mascot." Silence stretched between them like wire. Then Charles smiled. "That's exactly why I asked you." Ben shook his head. "Then ask me again, but this time as a partner, not a project." Charles reached out, extended his hand. "Ben Callahan, will you help me change the world?" Ben took it, on one condition. "Name it. You leave the titles in the drawer." The morning was cold and bright, with a thin crust of frost tracing the edges of the shelter's windows. Ben was halfway through mopping the common room floors, something he'd done every Tuesday since the heat went out last winter. It wasn't required, it just felt right. Routine had always grounded him more than therapy ever could. Luis appeared in the doorway, envelope in hand, eyebrows raised like he was holding something precious. "Hey, Sergeant," he said, holding it out. "Mail call." Ben looked up, confused. No one ever wrote to him, not since his discharge. Bills didn't come here, and most of the guys he'd served with had fallen off the map like he had. He took the envelope, rough fingers grazing the taped flap. The handwriting was shaky, the kind you get when your hands haven't held a pen in years. His name was scrawled in blocky letters, Ben C., Vet Shelter. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single creased piece of lined notebook paper, folded twice. He could smell cigarette smoke on it, maybe coffee too, and the words, crooked, uneven, hit harder than any speech or handshake ever had. "Ben, I didn't know where to send this. Didn't even know if you'd remember me. But I figured someone at the shelter would know where to find you. You probably don't think much about that day in the park, the sandwich, the coat, the coffee, but I do. I think about it every single morning, because that day you didn't just give me food, you gave me back something I'd forgotten I had. My name, my worth. You sat down next to me like I mattered, and I can't remember the last time anyone did that. You didn't flinch, you didn't preach, you just saw me. That night I slept under the same overpass, but I felt warmer than I had in months, and not just because of your jacket, because of something else, something I hadn't felt since I lost my wife, since I lost my job, since the bottle took more than it ever gave. I felt seen. It's been a few weeks now. I got into a transitional housing program through that new outreach center. You know, the one that popped up by the community kitchen. Heard your name's tied to it. Figures. I'm working dish shifts at St. Martin's Soup Hall. They pay in cash, and it's honest. The manager said I've got a knack for fixing things. Who knew? Maybe I'll get back into wiring if I can steady my hands enough. I tell everyone it started with a sandwich, but that's not true. It started with you, sitting next to me without pity, without judgment. Just a man giving another man a moment of dignity. I keep that jacket, by the way. Still patched, still smells like cold mornings and coffee. I wear it when I walk to work. It makes me feel like I'm worth the effort. So if you ever wonder, if you ever question whether what you're doing matters, I'm here to tell you it does. It mattered to me. It saved me. With deep respect, Joe Ben read the letter twice, then again, each word carved deeper than the last. His throat tightened, and for a long moment, he couldn't move. He folded the letter carefully, smoothing the creases with the side of his hand. Then he pulled out the inside pocket of his coat, stitched over more times than he could count, and tucked the note in with a care usually reserved for medals or dog tags. Outside, the sun was rising higher, the frost giving way to thaw. A new day, same streets. But everything felt different. Luis watched him from the hallway. "You okay?" Ben looked up, his voice thick but steady. "Yeah, I am." He turned and walked outside, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared. The city breathed around him, restless and sprawling, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt possible. The world hadn't changed overnight, but Joe had. And Ben, he had work to do. The first time Ben stood on the grounds of the old textile factory lot, wind whipping through the broken chain-link fence, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The lot was ugly. There was no denying it. Cracked concrete, rusted metal beams, an old generator half swallowed by vines and graffiti. The building itself was a skeleton of what it once was. 2 stories of busted-out windows and sagging support columns. But to Ben, it looked like a possibility. "This is the one," he said to Charles, who stood beside him, coat flapping in the sharp wind. Charles gave a nod, glancing down at the blueprint folder in his hand. "We can get the permits in 2 weeks. Environmental cleanup will take longer, but nothing insurmountable. Still sure you want to start here?" Ben looked out over the field of broken glass and wind-blown trash. "This place has been forgotten, same as the men we're trying to help. Feels like the right place to start." Charles smiled. Spoken like a man who remembers what matters. They spent the next several days walking other sites: abandoned schoolhouses, burned-out warehouses, and foreclosed community centers that had become playgrounds for weeds and silence. Each one told its own story. Each one had potential. Back at the mansion, the work began in earnest. Ben wasn't used to boardrooms, but Charles insisted he be there for every strategy meeting. They held them in the same study, around that old scarred desk. Some days it was just the 2 of them. Other days they were joined by architects, outreach coordinators, and former social workers who'd come out of retirement because they believed in the mission. Charles had hired a small but passionate team, people who understood both paperwork and poverty. And Ben, he brought the truth, the grit, the lived experience. He didn't speak often during those meetings, but when he did, people listened. Because when Ben said, "That plan won't work for someone who hasn't slept indoors in a week," or "That program sounds great on paper, but no guy I knew would sign up for it," people took notice. He wasn't just consulting. He was shaping the soul of it. One night, Charles invited Ben to stay for dinner, not at the formal table with 3 forks and 5 glasses, but in the kitchen. The chef, a burly ex-Marine named Dale, cooked them meatloaf and mashed potatoes. They ate in quiet camaraderie. "You're becoming the face of this thing whether you like it or not," Charles said, fork poised mid-air. Ben grimaced. Not a fan of being in front of the camera. That's exactly why you should be, Charles replied. People believe you because you're not selling them anything. Ben pushed his plate back, thinking, if I'm going to be the face, then the message has to be clear. This isn't charity, it's my responsibility. This country sent us off to war. They owe us more than a cot and a coffee. Charles raised his glass. To that. They clinked glasses and drank. Later, Ben returned to the shelter for one of the last nights he'd spend there. He sat on the same bench outside, watching the city move under dim yellow lights. He had new boots now, a warmer coat, even a bank account again. But the man inside hadn't changed. He still woke at 5 a.m. with military precision, still scanned rooms for exits, still took his coffee black. But there was a shift now, a subtle one. Instead of wondering how he'd get through another day, he was wondering what else he could build. The first time Ben saw his face on a television screen, it was in the common room of the shelter. Luis had paused mid-sweep to grab the remote, raising the volume. Hey, check it out, he said. You're famous. Ben drowned. The news segment showed a grainy clip from a press conference outside the first HOME project site. He stood at the podium, clearly uncomfortable, reading from a crumpled index card. His voice had been steady, his message clear, but seeing it play back, broadcast to thousands, it didn't feel real. They're calling you the quiet general, Luis said, grinning. Man of few words, big changes. Ben turned the volume down. Never asked for that. I know, Luis said, but maybe it's what people need. The conference had been Charles's idea, a way to introduce the project publicly and secure early support. They had donors, volunteers, contractors, and even a few senators showing interest. But none of it would have worked without Ben. He had stood at that podium, hands rough and face lined, and told a story not of pity, but of promise. This is not a rescue mission, he'd said. It's a restoration project, not just for buildings, for life. The crowd had gone silent, and then erupted in applause. Afterward, reporters surrounded him. Flashbulbs, microphones, questions. He answered only a few, then stepped aside. That night, Charles found him sitting alone backstage, tying and untying the same bootlace. You did good, Charles said. Ben nodded. I don't like being a symbol. You're not a symbol, Charles said. You're proof. Ben stood. Let's keep proving it. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the past found Ben again. He was standing in the shell of the first HOME facility, formerly an abandoned textile mill, now stripped to its bones. The walls echoed with the sound of hammers and buzzing saws, the air thick with the scent of sawdust and fresh paint. Volunteers moved like ants, laying insulation, measuring window frames, sweeping up drywall dust. Ben loved this part, the in-between, not ruin, not restoration, just the raw middle where anything was possible. He was reviewing a blueprint when a voice behind him froze his spine. Ben Callahan. He turned slowly. The man standing in the doorway looked 10 years older than the last time Ben had seen him, but the eyes were the same, sharp, restless, and filled with something between regret and defiance. Derek, Ben said. Derek Hayes had served beside Ben in Afghanistan. They'd shared tents, rations, and a dozen firefights, but Derek had gone down a different road after the war, one lined with bars, bail bonds, and burned bridges. Ben hadn't seen him in almost 8 years. I heard about this place, Derek said. Didn't think it was the same Callahan. But here you are." Ben studied him. The man was thinner now, leaner, but with a desperation in his posture that hadn't been there in the sand. "You hungry?" Ben asked, nodding toward the makeshift break table. Derek blinked, surprised. "Yeah, I could eat." They sat on overturned buckets with a couple of sandwiches wrapped in foil. Ben waited. He didn't push. Derek eventually spoke. "I've been in and out, got clean twice. Didn't stick, lost the house. Wife left. Last week I slept in a church basement with 50 other guys." Ben nodded slowly. "I know that road." "I heard about you," Derek continued, "on the news. Thought hell if he can do it." Ben set his sandwich down. "You want in?" Derek looked up. "Are you serious? This isn't a rescue line. You pull your weight, you show up, you keep clean. We'll put a hammer in your hand and a roof over your head." Derek stared at the sandwich in his hands like it was some kind of holy offering. "You always were the stubborn one." "Still am," Ben said, "so don't make me regret it." Derek's eyes shone just a little. "You won't." Ben didn't recognize him at first. The man who stepped into the HOME, the office, wore clean work jeans and a flannel shirt tucked in. His hair was neatly trimmed, and he stood with an ease that came from routine, not fear. But there was something in the way he held the door open, a pause, a hesitation that gave him away. Ben blinked. "Joe?" Joe smiled. "Thought you might have forgotten me." Ben stepped forward, shook his hand hard. "Not a chance." Joe looked around. "This place, I heard what you were doing. Had to come see it." "Glad you did," Ben said. Joe handed over a folded piece of paper. "I'm 2 months clean. Got a full-time job at the diner on 6th. They said I'm good with people. Me. Can you believe that?" Ben grinned. "I can." "I want to help," Joe said. "Not just donate, work, talk to guys like me. Maybe tell them it gets better." Ben nodded slowly. "We need someone to manage the grounds. Maintenance. Helping new guys get oriented." Joe's eyes widened. "You'd trust me with that?" Ben clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You already proved yourself. I'm just catching up." That afternoon, Joe started sweeping the entryway. By sunset, he'd memorized the names of every man who walked through the door. It didn't rain the day they opened the first HOME center. The sky was a clean, endless blue with just enough breeze to flutter the fresh banner stretched across the front of the building, Callahan Center for Renewal. Ben had argued against naming it after him. Charles insisted. In the end, they compromised. Ben chose the font and made sure the plaque inside listed every name that helped make it real. The ribbon cutting drew a crowd. There were former soldiers in worn uniforms, city officials in suits, volunteers in jeans, and a handful of men still wearing all they owned on their backs. Ben stood near the door, not on the stage. Charles did the speeches. Ben handed out coffee and quietly pointed veterans toward the intake table. Inside, the hallways gleamed with fresh paint. Dorm rooms lined one wing, classrooms the other. There was a kitchen, a community room, even a rooftop garden in progress. But the heart of the place wasn't in the design. It was in the way the first resident stepped inside, looked around, and wept. Ben saw it all from the corner. No cameras, no ceremony, just a man reclaiming a piece of himself. Later that night, as the building hummed with quiet life, Ben walked the halls. He paused outside room 3B, where Derek was unpacking donated clothes. Downstairs, Joe was tightening a leaky faucet with a steady hand. Ben leaned against the wall, eyes closed, listening to the gentle rhythm of people settling into safety. This was what they'd built, not just shelter, but sanctuary, and it was only the beginning. 3 weeks after the ribbon was cut, the center was no longer just a project, it was alive. Word had spread beyond the veteran shelter, beyond even the city. Small towns, churches, quiet social workers who never made the news but knew exactly where the broken ended up. They all began sending people, not cases, not statistics, people. And the center, still smelling of fresh paint and sawdust, opened its doors with the same quiet dignity that Ben had shown Joe in the park. Each new resident brought more than a duffel bag. They brought memory, weight, unspoken stories in the lines on their faces. Some arrived silent, some defiant. Some were drunk, trembling, or asleep on the stoop until someone gently woke them. Ben made it a point to greet each one. He'd show them to their rooms, modest, clean, with a bed, a locker, and a welcome card handwritten by someone who had arrived just days before. Joe ran the welcome desk now, keeping a logbook that he treated like a sacred text. He called each man by name, made sure they knew where to get socks, a toothbrush, and a hot meal. And then there was the garden, a half-acre rooftop space filled with soil from a farm Charles had once owned. Volunteers brought seedlings, local kids came to learn, and the residents came too, unsure at first, until they saw their efforts bloom. Basil, tomatoes, mint. Ben spent hours there, hands deep in the earth. Roots take time, he'd say. You've got to be patient. They'll grow when they're ready. The city noticed. Articles appeared, from soldier to shepherd, how Ben Callahan is redefining support for veterans. Donations increased. So did volunteers. But Ben kept the focus tight. We're not building a brand, he told Charles one night. We're building a family. So they kept it local, grounded, and Cedar Hill, once a forgotten corner of the city, became something else, a place people came home to. It was past midnight when Ben heard the knock. He'd been up late reviewing repair orders and quietly fixing a squeaky hinge on the east wing door. Most of the residents were asleep, their breathing echoing down the quiet halls. He opened the front door to find Joe standing there, not outside, but inside, holding a set of keys. They left this for you, Joe said, holding out a brass tag with Room 1A engraved on it. Said it's time. Ben drowned. I thought that room was for emergencies. It is, Joe replied. And you've been living out of the supply closet for a month. We figured that counts. Ben took the key. No fanfare, no speeches. The room was small, barely wider than a cell, but it had a window, a desk, a real mattress. Someone had set a mug on the table with "World's Okayest Boss" painted in chipped red letters. Probably Joe's doing. Ben stood for a long time in the doorway, unsure what to feel. He'd spent so long drifting from cots to bunks to benches that a room of his own felt heavy, like he had something to lose now. He placed the key on the table, sat on the bed, and breathed. The next morning, Ben found Charles and Joe in the rec room, standing beneath a newly mounted glass frame. Inside was a jacket, faded, patched at the elbows. The Army insignia is barely visible. It hung like a relic, but carried a weight that made Ben stop mid-stride. It was his, the same jacket he'd given Joe in the park all those weeks ago. Joe smiled gently. We had it cleaned, took it to a guy who does restoration for museums, said it still smelled like coffee. Ben stared at it, speechless. Charles stepped forward. We wanted the first thing people see when they come in here to be a reminder, not of war, but of grace. A small plaque beneath the jacket read, "One act of kindness, one chain is broken." Ben didn't speak. He just walked forward and touched the glass. It wasn't pride that filled him. It was something deeper: responsibility, continuity, and love for the people still fighting battles no one could see. Later that week, Ben and Charles stood on the rooftop garden, watching volunteers plant the last of the fall squash. The city skyline cut a jagged line across the horizon, the light slowly turning amber. "You ever think we'd get here?" Charles asked. Ben considered it. "Number. But I'm not surprised." Charles chuckled. "Of course not." They stood in silence for a while. Then Charles said, "I've been thinking about stepping back." Ben turned to him. "What do you mean?" "Not from the mission, just from the center stage. You've got this now. The team's solid. The next one, next city, we build it together, but you lead." Ben looked out at the rows of raised garden beds, at the newly paved path below where residents sat on benches talking softly, at the man from room 2C painting a mural on the wall, open hands joined together. "You sure?" Ben asked. Charles nodded. "The people believe in you, Ben. You've done what I couldn't. You've made this real." Ben didn't answer, not right away. He simply reached down, plucked a sprig of mint from the nearest planter, and tucked it behind his ear. Then he smiled. "Okay." Ben returned to the park bench on a rare day off. Same spot, same weathered wood, same dry fountain coughing leaves in the wind. He sat for a while, watching the world move by. Remembering, he thought of Joe, that first moment, tired eyes, cracked lips, silent gratitude. He thought of the jacket, the coffee, the soft ripple of trust. The bench was empty now, but not lonely, because this wasn't the end of something. It was the place where it had all begun. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a sandwich, wrapped in brown paper, edges neat. He laid it gently on the bench beside him, and a note, too, scrawled in black ink. "You're not alone. B." Then he stood, adjusted his coat, and walked away. Behind him, the sandwich waited, and the wind, always watching, carried the echo of change. 2 months after the center opened, the ripple had become a wave. What began as a single renovated factory was now a blueprint. Cities from across the state reached out. Mayors, veteran advocates, even business owners. They wanted to replicate what Ben and Charles had built. Not in name, but in spirit. Ben remained cautious. "We're not a franchise," he told the city rep from Lexington. "This isn't about expansion. It's about integrity." But he didn't say no. Instead, he proposed a coalition, a network of centers run locally but connected by purpose. He brought Joe to meetings, brought Derek, brought the new guy, Ali, who had arrived from Detroit with a black eye and no shoes, and now ran the morning shift in the kitchen. "Let them speak," Ben said. "They're the real testimony." And people listened. Charles coordinated the legal work. Sarah, Ben's sister, who hadn't spoken to him in years, reached out to help design the funding model. She was a real estate consultant now, sharp and quick, her voice softer when she said, "You look good, Ben." "I feel like something matters again," he told her. At the second coalition meeting, 6 cities signed on. Legacy had begun, and Ben, he just kept showing up. Ben wasn't used to polished envelopes with gold seals. When Luis handed it to him, he thought it was a mistake. "Looks official," Luis said. "Did you get drafted again?" Ben smirked and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from the office of the Speaker of the House, formal, respectful, full of titles. But the heart of it was clear. Ben Callahan had been nominated to receive the Congressional Medal for Civil Service, an honor rarely given to civilians, and even more rarely to men who refused the spotlight. He read it twice, then tossed it on his desk, unopened bills underneath it. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't until Charles came by that evening, holding a champagne bottle with a ridiculous bow on top, that the news got out. "They want to fly you to D.C., Charles said. "Full escort, black tie, medal around the neck." Ben just looked at him. "I'd rather stay here and fix the leaking water heater." "But this matters," Charles insisted. "You matter." Ben sighed. "Then let them come here. Let them see the work." 3 weeks later, the congressman did come. No cameras, just 2 aides and a notebook. He shook Ben's hand and stayed for lunch. When he left, he said, "You're changing the definition of public service." Ben didn't reply, just handed him a folder labeled "How to Start a Center in Your District." Ben rose before the sun, as always. The center was quiet, the kind of hush that lives between night and morning. He moved through the halls like a caretaker, not a leader. He picked up a crumpled napkin, straightened a painting one of the residents had hung crooked. He checked the garden irrigation timer, then fed the chickens out back. They had chickens now, 5 of them. Joe called them the Board of Directors. As the sky turned pale pink, Ben sat on the back stoop with a cup of coffee. He wrote in a small leather notebook, something new, thoughts, reminders, pieces of himself he didn't want to forget. Today's entry was short. "We built something, not perfect, not finished, but real. They say you can measure a man by what he leaves behind, but I think maybe it's who he stands beside while he's still here that matters more." The back door creaked. Joe appeared with 2 steaming mugs. "I thought I'd find you here." Ben nodded. "Same as every morning." They sat in silence, side by side, friends, builders, and still, somehow, rebuilding themselves. The mansion hadn't changed much, still pristine, still quiet, but when Ben walked through the doors this time, it didn't feel like entering someone else's world. It felt like a return. Charles met him in the kitchen. No suit, just jeans and a faded gray tee. The same one he'd worn when they toured the second HOME site. "Got a call this morning," Charles said. "The foundation board voted unanimous." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You're officially chair of community operations." Ben snorted. "Do I get a coffee mug?" "I had one made," Charles said, laughing. "It says, 'Grumpy is the new grateful.'" They sat at the same kitchen table where they'd shared meatloaf months ago. This time they talked like partners. Ben shared ideas about mobile outreach vans, about integrating agriculture programs. Charles floated options for national funding, but neither spoke about titles or legacy. They talked about people, and when they were done, Ben stood, looked around, and said, "We should donate this place." Charles blinked. "The mansion?" Ben nodded. "Make it a recovery house for former CEOs who finally want to do some good." Charles grinned. "You know what? That might just work." By the time spring arrived, the first group of residents had been housed, employed, or reconnected with family. One by one, they left the center not just better, but transformed. It was time for something else to shift. Ben gathered the team in the dining hall. Joe, Derek, Sarah, the outreach coordinators, volunteers who had become staff, even the original city shelter director. He cleared his throat. "I'm stepping back," he said. Not out, just back. This place needs fresh voices, people who know the streets now, not just remember them. He turned to Joe. You're the director now. Joe's eyes widened. Me? You've been doing the job already, Ben said. This just makes it official. Derek would oversee logistics. Sarah would continue as advisor. Ben, he'd still be there, fixing pipes, tending gardens, watching over the porch with his coffee in hand. Later that day, someone taped a sign to his office door. Ben Callahan, founder, farmer, friend. He left it there, and when a new resident arrived that night, shaking and silent, Ben was the one who opened the door. Welcome home, he said, and meant it. There was a rhythm to life at the Callahan Center now. Morning coffee at sunrise, staff check-ins, new arrivals, gardens watered, pipes fixed, laughter in the common room. Occasionally, tears, but always movement, always growing. Ben moved through it like a steady current. Present, unshakable, part of the structure now, not just the building, but the lives. He no longer needed to lead from the front. Others had stepped forward. Joe was a natural, warm, sharp, firm when needed. Derek handled logistics with military efficiency, and Sarah, now sitting on 2 nonprofit boards, had become a fierce advocate for funding and policy reform. Ben kept the same room, room 1A, still minimal, still his. One quiet evening, he sat by the window writing in his notebook when a knock came at the door. It was Joe, holding a small package. This came for you, he said. No return address. Ben opened it carefully. Inside was a folded note and a silver coin, tarnished with age. The note read, Ben, your kindness reaches farther than you know. I found my son because of you. He was in a shelter across the country. Now he's home. Some debts can't be repaid, but they can be passed forward. MC. Ben held the coin in his palm, closed his eyes. The world didn't need to know, but he did. He was home. Ben stood on the rooftop garden during a rare afternoon break, watching a group of new arrivals plant their first seeds. One, a kid barely 20 with hollow eyes, asked if tomatoes really grew this fast. Depends on how much you talk to them, Ben said. The kid blinked. Seriously? Ben smiled. Plants like attention, just like people. Later, Joe sat beside him with a clipboard of intake notes. You know, we're up to 4 locations now, he said. Cedar Hill, Lexington, Tulsa, and Riverside. And next year we're looking at Detroit. Ben nodded slowly. It's working. You ever think it'd get this big? Ben looked out over the garden at the rows of green poking through soil once thought barren. No, he said, but I always hoped. Joe hesitated, then asked, Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't sat on that bench that day? Ben thought of the sandwich, the jacket, the coffee. I didn't change the world, he said. I just didn't look away. That night he found the bench again. The city had replaced the slats and installed a plaque nearby. One small act, one ripple, one life reclaimed. Ben sat for a while and smiled. Ben was never a man of many words, but the impact of his presence stretched wide. He'd become a symbol, not of heroism, but of consistency. He showed up, he listened, he remembered birthdays, knew how each resident took their coffee, built trust the way he fixed a broken step, carefully, deliberately, and without shortcuts. One spring morning, Charles came by with a film crew in tow. They wanted to shoot a short documentary for a National Service Award. Ben refused the spotlight, but he said yes to one thing, a walk. They followed him through the halls as he greeted residents by name, through the garden, to the room where he first unpacked, to the rec room where his jacket hung in glass. They ended at the rooftop. "What do you want people to take from this?" the producer asked. Ben looked at the camera for a long time before saying, "Don't underestimate what kindness costs or what it saves. You don't need $1 million, you just need to show up." It became the closing line of the documentary. Within days, the clip went viral, but Ben didn't watch it. He was too busy helping someone fix a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. In late summer, Charles surprised Ben with a trip. He didn't say where they were going, just that Ben should pack a weekend bag and trust him. When they arrived, Ben recognized it instantly. A quiet stretch of land outside Bloomington, rolling hills, old red barn, wind chimes on the porch, the kind of place you'd expect to find chickens pecking the dirt and a dog dozing in the sun. It was Charles's childhood farm. "I bought it back," Charles said, stepping out of the car. "Thought maybe we could turn it into something." Ben walked the perimeter slowly, soil rich beneath his boots, wind clean through the trees. "A retreat," he finally said. "Not a shelter, just a place to breathe, for vets who need stillness before starting over." Charles nodded. "Exactly what I was thinking." They spent the weekend mapping it out. A few cabins here, a barn converted into gathering space, a garden, maybe even horses. On Sunday morning, Ben stood alone at the edge of the field, the sky streaked with orange. He felt it in his chest, not weight, but lightness. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The Callahan Center was celebrating its 2nd anniversary. The halls buzzed with energy. Staff, residents, alumni, even city officials and press, though Ben managed to mostly dodge them. Joe gave the speech, this time, clear, confident, with just enough sarcasm to keep things grounded. Ben stood near the back, coffee in hand, watching faces light up. There was music, food, and a mural unveiling. At one point, a young man in a clean hoodie approached Ben. "You're the guy, right? From the sandwich story?" Ben nodded once. "Yeah." The kid's voice trembled. "I was in juvie when I saw that video. Thought maybe life wasn't over." Ben put a hand on his shoulder. "It's never over. You just need one step forward." Later that night, Ben returned to his room, sat by the window, and opened his notebook. "We built this on coffee, on broken boots and stubborn grace. But mostly, we built it on belief. Quiet, steady belief that people are worth the work." He set the notebook down and looked out at the stars. He was no longer the man on the bench. He was the one building benches for others. And the story, though never simple, had found its ending. Or perhaps its beginning.